Stephen. It's a great pleasure for me to be here. Hello, everybody. It's about 10 o'clock in the morning in New York, and it's my first visit to Africa and Ghana in particular. So I'm very excited to be here, although it is only virtual, but maybe someday I'll get to come to your wonderful country and meet some of you, or maybe we'll see each other at conferences somewhere. All right, well, so like I said, I'm very happy to be here. Let me just start with the talk. It has two parts. I don't think it will take the full hour, so maybe we could have time for questions afterward or discussion about anything. It doesn't have to be related to the talk if people would like to. But all right, so let me begin. Okay, so we'll see if this will work. All right. Right, so the topic is something about dynamical systems that I've been interested in for many years, really since my postdoctoral work, about how systems in nature and math manage to get themselves in sync. So I want to focus on both the math and the science of synchronization, but I realize that as numerical analysts and mathematicians, you may want to hear more about the mathematical side. So I'll definitely show you some of that too. And I don't assume that you're an expert in this area or that you've even thought about it. It'll be a very introductory talk, I hope. All right, so let's see what I need to do to move the page. There we go. All right, so let's first talk about some real world examples of systems that synchronize themselves. Here's an example you may have seen on the internet. It's a very popular video on YouTube. There are many like this. They often have more than 1 million views. And what you're about to see is this gentleman is, he's got metronomes, you know, of the type that you would use in music to keep time, to set a beat, a steady tempo. And you can maybe see that the metronomes, there's 5 of them and they're sitting on a wooden board. Ah, good. I hope, were you not able to see the screen until now? Now you can see it, good. Okay, so we've got these metronomes. They're on a wooden board, and he's going to set them all ticking. And at first, they won't get in sync with each other. But then when he lifts the board and puts it on top of these empty soda cans, the board will be able to roll a little bit on top of the empty cans. And the motion of that platform will cause the metronomes to feel inertial forces as they're in an accelerating reference frame. And it'll be enough to get them spontaneously to synchronize. So watch how it goes. It's actually sort of a longer video than you might think. It goes on for like 2 minutes, because at first it seems like the metronomes are getting in sync, but then they don't. And then it takes quite a few ticks before they actually do get in sync. Okay, so be patient. Here we go. So I let that run for a while just so you could see how it really will stay synchronized at that point. It's not going to unlock itself. But this phenomenon, although it's become very popular thanks to YouTube, has been known for a long time. And I would say it goes back to the middle 1600s with this work by Christian Huygens, the famous Dutch physicist and mathematician. He discovered something when, sort of by accident. He was sick. He was lying around in his bedroom. And he had, these are his drawings from that time in a letter to his father. He had invented the pendulum clock. I mean, there were pendulum clocks, but he sort of perfected it, made it into a workable timekeeping device. And he had built two of them. And he noticed that they were spontaneously swinging in unison, although in antiphase. So when one pendulum would move to the left, the other one would move to the right, sort of like, you know, two hands coming together and going back and forth clapping. And so then he tried to understand, how could they possibly get themselves in sync? What was causing them to communicate? And he thought there might be some kind of vibration that was sending a signal. So he tried an experiment where he took some wooden planks, like wooden beams, and put them on the top of two chairs. And then he hung his pendulum clocks from those boards. And as they would swing, they would cause the wooden boards to move a little bit, just like you were seeing with the pendulum and the platform that it was on, sorry, with the metronomes shaking the board. And so he concluded that it was these very tiny, almost imperceptible vibrations that were enough to cause what he called this odd sympathy of clocks to get into sync. And he tried to give an explanation of it down here, a mechanical explanation that was, you know, very good for its time. But if it all seems kind of silly to you, like, well, who cares about, you know, metronomes or pendulum clocks? I want to give you a real world example of synchronization that came as a big surprise to engineers in the year 2000. It was the opening day of London's new footbridge across the Thames River, the Millennium Bridge. If you've been to London, you may have walked across this bridge. And here on opening day, June 10th, 2000, the Queen was there. You see her there in the middle, and all kinds of other officials. And everyone was very excited about this new bridge in London. And many thousands of people showed up to be there for opening day. So the Queen walked across, the BBC was there to take video footage of the happy occasion. And then something strange happened that nobody expected, that the architects didn't know about, the engineers didn't know about, which was that the bridge started to move as people walked across it. And the surprising thing was that the bridge didn't move vertically. I mean, people knew that if you, like, for instance, if you have soldiers marching in step across a bridge, then if the bridge is not designed correctly, the bridge might start vibrating in the vertical direction, up and down. And it could even potentially resonate with the footsteps of the soldiers. And that has happened, that soldiers have caused bridges to collapse because of resonant excitation of the vertical mode of oscillation. But that's not what happened on the Millennium Bridge. Every engineer nowadays knows about that phenomenon of vertical excitation. The strange thing that happened on the Millennium Bridge is that it started to move sideways. It was wobbling sideways, moving back and forth in the horizontal plane. And that caused people to feel uncomfortable and to change the way they walked. And they started to feel better and more stable. They started to get in sync with the motion of the bridge, which caused the bridge to move further, because these people were inadvertently pumping energy into the bridge and making its vibrations worse. So you'll see that in this video of live footage of what was happening on opening day. And so watch carefully. You'll be able to see the crowd rocking in step. All right, so there's the bridge. Not the best footage, but I think you'll be able to see. And there's a BBC commentator describing what happened.
The most dramatic and shocking footage shows whole sections of the crowd, hundreds of people, apparently rocking from side to side in unison, not only with each other, but with the bridge. This synchronized movement seemed to be driving the bridge. But how could the crowd become synchronized?
And so that's the question then for us as mathematicians. Can we give some mathematical explanation for what happened on the Millennium Bridge, or even with the metronomes? Why do they get in sync? How can we understand why this is happening? So before I get to that, I want to discuss many other examples of living things that get in sync. in addition to people on the Millennium Bridge, here's a bigger, like a shot from a farther distance in case you haven't seen the bridge, you're not familiar with it. But there are many other, you don't have to be human beings. Fireflies, these little beetles that flash and emit light in parts of the world like Thailand or Malaysia, Borneo. Those fireflies gather by the thousands in trees at night along rivers, along riverbanks, tidal rivers, and they will flash on and off in sync. And biologists are still trying to understand why they do this. It's clearly related to mating because it's only the male fireflies that are in sync. But there's been a question, is it somehow to attract females of the same species, send them a specific signal? It seems to be that. But why would they cooperate and do that with each other? I mean, each one wants to mate with the female. So how does that help them to coordinate their flashes? There's still discussions about that from an evolutionary perspective. Why would that be beneficial to an individual? Here's an example actually from neuroscience. These are neurons that were grown in a dish, and they are stained with a calcium sensitive dye so that when they flash, when they fire an action potential, they will actually be visible as if they were fireflies flashing. So let me just show you what that looks like. So keep your eye on the bottom left panel here. You'll see lots of neurons firing all in sync. Boom. And, it's somehow qualitatively the same kind of thing. These are individual cells that are somehow coupled in a way that gets them to organize and flash in unison or fire in unison. Now in the heart, that's a very important thing. You've got specialized cells in your heart that send electrical impulses to the ventricles of the heart, the part that pumps blood to the rest of your body. And it's essential that your ventricles contract in a coordinated way. Otherwise, blood doesn't get pumped, and it's very bad for you. I mean, you could die from an arrhythmia if your heart pacemaker cells were not firing in unison. So we have lots of examples in nature where systems get in sync spontaneously. And also, you don't even have to be alive, as we've seen with the metronomes. There are many technological uses of synchrony, arrays of many lasers. In the power grid, we've got generators that rotate in unison across vast geographical distances to set a frequency standard for a whole country or even a continent. There are superconducting devices called Josephson junctions that are the most sensitive detectors of weak magnetic fields. They use synchronization at the level of quantum mechanical wave functions. And even a familiar example, here's the moon. You always see the same face of the moon, which is a little bit confusing since the moon rotates on its axis. Why don't we ever see the back of the moon? But we don't, and it's because of synchronization between the spin of the moon around its axis and the orbital period of the moon as it goes around the Earth. It spins once on its axis for every one revolution through a one-to-one synchronization mechanism called tidal locking. So we see all kinds of examples of synchrony in the real world, and that's sort of the scientific part of what I wanted to discuss with you. Let me now turn to the mathematical side, which is if we want to understand mathematically how these kinds of self-synchronizing systems work, we have two options. We could make very detailed physical or biological models, either of metronomes or fireflies or the moon or heart cells. And if we do that in each case, it's going to be kind of complicated. I mean, I've worked on things like that, and it's interesting to try to get the physics right or the biology, but I don't really want to talk about that with you today. I want to talk about a simpler model that kind of applies to almost all these systems. So that's, first I want to justify why is that reasonable? Why would we resort to these simple models? And it's because it's hard to do the analysis properly. To really work mathematically on any of these examples, it's difficult for various reasons. For one thing, the individual oscillators, whether they're heart cells or metronomes, they're nonlinear oscillators. These are not the linear harmonic oscillators that you would have studied in your first course in differential equations or your first course in physics. These have to be nonlinear oscillators. they don't obey a superposition principle. I mean, they have to be analyzed with the methods of nonlinear dynamics because they have attractors. They have these stable limit cycles, which are special sets of states that form a loop in the state space, and the system moves around on that loop and is attracted to that loop of states. If it's a little bit off, it gets attracted onto there. Like these systems regulate their amplitude is what I'm trying to say. They can't just oscillate at any amplitude like a simple harmonic oscillator could. So the nonlinear dynamics of such systems is pretty hard to analyze if you've ever studied that. It's not a trivial thing to study even an individual nonlinear oscillator. You can't, for instance, you can't write down analytical solutions typically for the oscillation, the periodic behavior. You need qualitative geometrical methods to study these things. Or computation, like you are all experts in with numerical analysis. We can certainly compute limit cycles numerically, but if we want to study them without the use of the computer, we use these qualitative methods that Poincaré introduced a long time ago. So that's one difficulty. The individual oscillators are nonlinear. Another thing is that these problems involve two or more timescales. You saw that already with the metronomes, that there was the timescale of an individual tick, but then it took many hundreds of ticks, or certainly dozens of ticks, for the system to get into sync. So you have two timescales operating, a fast and a slow, and maybe even more than two. That tends to make the problem hard. Another thing is that the dynamics can often have a problem with smoothness. You have sudden impulses in the case of metronomes or pendulum clocks. At each endpoint of its swing, it gets a jolt of mechanical energy from a device called an escapement that's built into the pendulum clock or the metronome that keeps its amplitude from decaying. So there's this impulsive energy, or in the case of neurons or heart cells, there are sudden spikes, action potentials. These tend to make the math harder because you have these, smooth and non-smooth dynamics at the same time. Also, the state spaces are inherently high dimensional. To describe a neuron properly, or it might take hundreds of variables, all the different ionic channel openings and closings. The conductance is, these are quantified by conductances. There's also concentrations of different chemicals, all the different species of calcium, potassium, sodium. So many variables per oscillator in general. Also, many oscillators. We saw with the fireflies, there could be thousands of them, same thing with heart cells. Finally, they are not necessarily connected in a simple way. There's topological or graph theoretic issues of how is this system of oscillators interconnected. So there's really a lot going on. And it's for this reason that we want to think about the simplest possible mathematical problems to study the essence of synchronization. Now, I said that you have to think of these as limit cycle oscillators, and let me say a little more about that in case you're not super familiar with them. Imagine a two-dimensional state space. So here's a picture in the plane. I've got this loop of states that represent, like it might be, if it were a firefly, maybe the firefly flashes when it gets to this point in state space, then having flashed, it starts building up to the next flash. There are chemical changes or neurological changes happening. When it gets back around to this point, it flashes again. If the system happens to be off the standard cycle at, let's say, these 2 points, it goes through a sequence of states that attract it back onto the cycle. That's the limit in the limit cycle, that it's a limiting loop that other trajectories approach. Same thing if we start on the inside, it might spiral out onto the cycle. Okay, so that's what a limit cycle looks like. Now, we're going to imagine a population of many of these limit cycle oscillators interacting, and they are hard to analyze, but these two gentlemen figured out a way to make progress. So Art Winfrey, who was a biologist but trained in physics and very comfortable with math, introduced the idea of reducing the problem to a phase description, where instead of thinking about all the variables, like I mentioned, there might be hundreds of variables per oscillator, he found a way to reduce the problem to just one variable per oscillator, which is its phase think of it as sort of a coordinate that tells you where it is along its cycle. And that's what I'm using this symbol phi to denote the phase of the oscillator. He found that in the limit, also Yoshiki Kuramoto, a statistical physicist in Japan, refined Winfrey's work and made this very elegant model that I'm going to spend a lot of time discussing with you. And so their work was in a certain limit of perturbation theory where the problem simplified. So they considered oscillators that were almost identical, meaning they'd have the same frequency, the same limit cycles, the same everything, except for a small correction. And they're almost independent. They're coupled, but very weakly. So there were two small things happening: the deviation from identicalness and the strength of the interaction. If both of those are weak, in a certain sense, weak compared to the strength of attraction to the limit cycle, using perturbation theory, they were able to prove that the long-term dynamics of a system of nonlinear limit cycle oscillators would always have this universal form. It would always look like the rate of change of phase would be a constant, omega sub I, which tells you something about the frequency of the oscillator, and a series of interaction terms that involve the coupling between all the different oscillators. So what's going on here is I have some interaction function f. Notice it doesn't have any subscript on it. It's the same f for all the oscillators, and that's because of this assumption of them being nearly identical. They all have identical interactions with each other through this f. However, they do have a term kij, which encodes the topology of who's connected to who. That's the graph theoretic part. The different interaction strengths come in through this matrix kij, sort of like an adjacency matrix in graph theory, except it also has weights telling us how strong the interactions are between oscillators I and j. So this is a big improvement because now it's only one variable per oscillator. I is the index telling me oscillators 1 up through n. It's only one variable, phi sub I, but still there's a lot of complications because of this kij and because these omegas might be some complicated set of numbers. So it's really still too complicated, and also this f might be some complicated periodic function. So Kuramoto is the one who found a way to study the simplest problem that is still interesting, and that's what I want to focus on for the rest of our discussion. It's known today as the Kuramoto model. So here's a specific choice for that interaction function f, just a sine function. And you'll notice that the kij has now been replaced by just a constant k over a number n. And what's basically happening here is he's studying a particular graph. He's thinking of the complete graph where every oscillator interacts with every other oscillator. It's a really special case. Rather than a network like a square lattice or a line or a chain, a ring or something, he's going to assume every oscillator is coupled to every other with some strength k. He normalizes with this factor 1 over n because he wants to think about the infinite n limit. So as he takes n to infinity, which is a kind of a standard move since he is a statistical physicist, they're used to thinking about the large n limit of a problem. Things will become simpler as n goes to infinity. He wants to divide by n so that this whole term becomes an average, and it will have a nice, well-defined average in the infinite n limit. So we're going to think about large n. The coupling is all to all, which in statistical physics would be called the mean field approximation. It's not, I mean, it's a big approximation, but it's sort of the simplest way to study a many-body problem, or in this case, a many oscillator problem. If you want to think about it intuitively, what the mean field assumption is saying is, like, imagine being in an audience where you're clapping your hands and everyone wants to clap in unison. Then one way you could try to do this is you could listen to your neighbor, but another way is you could listen to the whole room. Like if you're out of step with the whole room, then you'll adjust the timing of your claps to get into phase with the rest of the clapping in the room. And that's kind of what a mean field approximation is saying, that every oscillator is thinking about the mean of the rhythm produced by
Oh,
all.
You can't tell my film.
Sounds like someone has unmuted themselves. Excuse me. Okay. So anyway, I could pause in case, I mean, would anyone like to ask any questions at some point? Like, we could wait till the end for questions, but if you would like to ask, I'm happy to take questions at any stage. I don't want to lose you here. People could, I mean, I could check the chat if that's a good idea. Should I do that? Or we can wait. I don't see anything in the chat at the moment. All right, so let me keep going. All right, so we've got this mean field approximation, and these omegas, Kuramoto assumes, these frequencies, he thinks of them as being random numbers. And that's because in any population of real oscillators, they won't be identical. There will be some mean frequency, which he calls capital omega, and then some distribution of the frequencies around that mean. And he calls that distribution, he says it has a density, he calls G of omega. He thinks of it for simplicity as being symmetrical and bell-shaped, sort of Gaussian looking. Just again, for simplicity. He's always making the simplest choice he can think of to deal with this really hard, large dimensional dynamical system, nonlinear dynamical system. He did his work around 1975. It's now more than 40 years that Kuramoto's work was introduced. Incidentally, you might want to watch a YouTube video of him talking about this. When he did this work, it was not well appreciated at the time. Colleagues in Japan were telling him they didn't know what he was doing. They didn't think it made much sense. And he was pretty discouraged as a young researcher at that time. It's a really interesting video to listen to him recall what it was like. Now we all accept this as one of the primary insightful ways of making progress and giving us intuition about large systems of oscillators and how they get in sync. But it was not really well appreciated at the beginning. Anyway, so he's got these random frequencies, the sign coupling, everyone connected to everyone. And I want to show you a video of how this behaves, or a simulation, because I know you like numerical things, and also it gives a lot of intuition about what's going on with this system of differential equations. So let me move to that next to give you a feeling. It's an online simulator by a German physicist named Dirk Brockmann. You can find it yourself. You know, if you want to play with it in your own time, it's called Ride My Kuramoto Cycle. And it's fun. I'm just going to click there. I hope this will work. I'm going to jump out to the internet and just run the simulator and show you what it's all about. So let's see if this will work. I hope you can still see what's happening. I guess you can. Sharing my screen. So actually, I worked a little with Dirk Brockmann on this. You could see he gave me co-authorship, which was nice, but really it's all his work. So here it is. He's, let me turn on some color. It's this button that says Orley's Magic Switch. And now you see a collection of dots of different colors. Those dots represent oscillators. And you should think of them as points on the unit circle. Okay, so they're just points moving in the complex plane on the unit circle. And so think of it as like, you know, each phase variable, theta, that's what we're looking at. And it's like we're doing e to the I theta. So here at angle theta from the origin, let's see, I'm pointing at a green dot. So what do the colors mean? The colors tell you something about the frequency of the oscillator, the omega for that oscillator. And so the idea is frequency of visible light goes from low frequency, which would be red, to high frequency, which would be violet. And so these different colors are telling you in the same way as the electromagnetic spectrum, what the inherent frequency of the oscillator is. I said the unit circle, you might see that there's some, you know, they're not actually on the single circle, and that's just for visibility. They're supposed to all be on the same circle, but you can see them better if you separate them in radius a little bit. Okay, and then if you press this button, they start to run around the circle, and you know, nothing very interesting is happening. It's just a lot of colors running around, and the system is not getting in sync. And that's because we have these different sliders. And this one is a slider for coupling strength, and it's currently set to 0. That's the variable K, the coupling strength. Now, watch what happens if I increase the coupling. So here you have to pay attention because something is going to happen fast. As I turn up the coupling strength all the way to the maximum, you'll see the system spontaneously synchronize. And it's now gone into a rainbow of oscillators arranged by frequency. They're all running around together, sort of like runners running around a track. They're all staying together as a pack, with in the front, the purple ones are the inherently fastest. They have the highest frequency. They're in the front. The slowest ones are the red ones. They're in the back. If you want to see that again, let me restart. So I'll do random initial conditions, and you see that system quickly converges to get into synchrony. Could do that again, random, whoop, they get into sync spontaneously. So this model will spontaneously synchronize if the coupling is large enough. If I reduce the coupling, you'll see that they start to spread out in phase. The pack is not as tight. They're still synchronized in the sense of all running at the same frequency, but it's now a broader dispersion of phases. I could reduce the coupling still more, and they should spread out more. Now, one question you might have is it always like this? Do they always run as a pack, or can something else happen? And I think if I get to just the right, something interesting is happening here, isn't it? Look, it looks like some of the purple ones have broken away. They're not actually in sync with the others. We can see this more clearly, actually, if we go into a co-rotating frame that's rotating with the frequency of the main pack. So I have this button, which lets me go into that moving reference frame. What I just did by going into that frame is I froze the pack. We're now moving at the frame at the frequency of this group of orange and yellow and green oscillators, and they look frozen. But the blue and the red, which are at the tails of the frequency distribution, notice that they are not frozen. They're continuing to move. So that's an interesting phenomenon. The population has split into a subpopulation that is motionless in the rotating frame, those being the oscillators in the middle of the frequency distribution. They have the middle colors. And then the extreme oscillators that are red and blue, those you see are desynchronized. They continue to run around even in this rotating frame.
Question?
Yes, please.
This happens only because of the omega I, right? I mean, the
Yes.
random omega I. If you didn't
That's
have
right.
it, then you wouldn't have this effect.
Exactly right.
Okay.
Exactly. That's wonderful. That's the point. It's because we have this distribution of the omegas, and it has tails. And so the oscillators in the tails, if the coupling is not strong enough, some of those oscillators break away. That's what we're seeing.
That's right. Nice. Thanks.
And so it's really interesting, right? I mean, we didn't see that when the coupling was high. Then everybody was synchronized. So there's this interesting intermediate range of coupling that is hard to find because it only occurs over a narrow range, but it was somewhere around here where it looked like for this finite number of oscillators, it wasn't quite enough to hold the purple and the red. They broke away, but these ones, the orange and the green and the yellow, they stayed frozen. Now, it was helpful to go into this co-moving frame. I mean, back in the original frame, it's distracting. It's harder to see what's going on. But anyway, this is the kind of thing that Kuramoto tried to explain. I'll jump out of this, this simulator. You could, like I say, you could play with it on your own time. It's pretty interesting. But what's amazing is that back when Kuramoto was doing this work in 1975, he guessed all of this in his head. He didn't even do computer simulations back then. He just thought about it and made a guess that led him to the analysis that I want to show you now. So, I mean, that's going to be the rest of the talk. I'd like to just sort of walk you through. Oh, actually, I should have shown you this idea of the order parameter. Maybe I will. Let me just jump back out. I'm sorry. Because this is an important concept in Kuramoto's work. This is a standard idea in statistical physics, the idea of an order parameter, but let me illustrate it because it's here in this simulator. Maybe I'll make this a little bigger for you to see it better. So, all right, we'll go back to this with color. We'll let it run. So what do I mean by the order parameter? Ah, darn it. Where did that go? Is that still running? Yeah, there it is. Here, show order parameter. If I press this dot, this button, this dot in the middle, think of it as an average in the XY plane of all of these dots. So you can see when they're randomly scattered around the circle, the average X and the average Y is going to be close to 0. And what I'm graphing here is the radius of this dot. How far is it from the origin? And it's pretty close to the origin, just bobbling around because of statistical fluctuations. On the other hand, if I make the system get in sync by increasing the coupling strength, then the order parameter you see now comes with a significant radius. Like if all the dots were on top of each other on the unit circle, their average would be on the unit circle as well. And this would have a radius of 1, which is pretty close to what it's showing now. It's not quite at 1. I mean, I should probably have axes on here so you could see, but this is like almost maximum order. And you can see in this picture that the order parameter has gotten to a very large number. If we go to something intermediate, I might as well go back into this co-rotating frame. Then if you're in the rotating frame, the axes look like they're rotating, but the oscillators appear frozen. But if I reduce the coupling strength to where it was interesting, like say down here, you see that the orders start to decrease. You can maybe see that with the system. It should start to, those blue and yellow should break away. Sorry, the blue and the red should break away. And the order parameter will decrease, but Kuramoto predicts that it will eventually reach some steady level. I mean, that's what he guessed, that the order parameter would still approach a constant. I wonder if that's true. I mean, it's sort of, it went down and it's going up a little. It's not very clear from this simulation, but we don't have a large N. I could also increase the number of oscillators. Ooh, that did something dramatic. If I increase the number of oscillators, it will help reduce the statistical fluctuations. And you can see that there's this population that's kind of locked, not moving. And then there's some other population that's drifting around. And the hope is that this will go to some constant value, more or less. And Kuramoto wants to calculate what that is. So let me stop this simulation and tell you now how we're going to analyze this with math. So let's go back here. The concept of the order parameter I just introduced, it's the average of all the dots on the unit circle. We think of it in the complex plane. So it has a radius and an average angle, big theta, sort of shown here. And when R is close to 0, it's kind of a state like this, whereas when it's close to 1, it's fairly synchronized. And what I want you to sort of see from the simulations, although it wasn't very clear what I just showed, is that if you fix the distribution of the frequencies and you fix the coupling strength, you get two types of behavior depending on if the coupling is small or large. If it's very small, like close to 0, in fact, the system doesn't synchronize at all. The order collapses to near 0, and it's basically like throwing dots on the circle at random. The order parameter will be on the order of 1 over square root of n, just from averaging random numbers on the unit circle, random complex numbers. That's a state I'm going to call incoherent. It's as if they were uncoupled effectively. On the other hand, if K is large enough, the R will grow to some level, and Kuramoto predicts it will become constant if you wait for a long time and if n goes to infinity. And so we'll call that number R infinity, assuming it is some constant. And in simulations, if we had done simulations with a much larger number of oscillators, you would find, and it's easy to do, I mean, these are easy ordinary differential equations to integrate. You'll see that this R infinity appears to be independent of the initial conditions. The system just has one attractor, and it just finds that attractor and goes to some value of R infinity that depends on K, but not on the initial conditions for a fixed distribution of these frequencies. And so that's the math question. I mean, is any of this really true? And what the simulations suggest? And if so, how does this R infinity depend on K? That's what I want to spend the rest of the time telling you about, just sketching the argument, because it's such a pretty, it's an amazingly beautiful mathematical argument, and it's kind of elementary, but it's very clever in the way that physicists often come up with these ingenious arguments. I think this is a prime example of one. And it actually raised a lot of mathematical questions that have kept us busy for many years. So what Kuramoto found is that the R depends on K in a manner that looks like a phase transition, that he predicts in the infinite n limit, the system will have zero order until some critical value K sub C. And after that, it rises like a square root and then asymptotes to 1 as K goes to infinity. So it's not that there's more and more order in some smooth way as you increase the coupling. It literally has zero order until a critical value, and then it suddenly turns on. And so that was, you could imagine, of great excitement to physicists because they love phase transitions. And for those of us in dynamical systems, it's really neat because it's a bifurcation that we would like to understand. So the questions then, many questions. I mean, from this picture are, what is this K sub C in terms of the density of the natural frequencies? Can we calculate K sub C? Also, can we calculate this curve? I mean, what is that curve? And also, you know, like in bifurcation theory, you would expect that this state would be stable below the threshold and that this branch would be stable. It looks like a supercritical pitchfork or Hopf bifurcation in the language of nonlinear dynamics. So you'd expect this branch stable here and this branch stable here, and then a zero branch over here to be unstable. Can we show that? Well, we could try linear stability arguments with eigenvalues, or you could try global stability arguments with something more sophisticated. And, you know, all of this has been predicated on the idea that we're doing the infinite n problem. Can we say anything about the finite n problem? So here's what's known, and I'm going to sketch a little bit of it for you. Kuramoto himself calculated the critical coupling, and he calculated this curve. And I'll show you his argument, and that'll be the end of the talk. Now, there's a lot since then. With my collaborator, Rennie Merola, we figured out the linear stability problem for this branch. And surprisingly, it's not stable in the sense that you might think. It's actually neutrally stable in terms of the density of the oscillators. It has many, the stability problem has many eigenvalues. In fact, a continuum of eigenvalues, I should say a continuous spectrum on the imaginary axis. It's exactly neutral, but yet it appears to be stable when you look at the level of the order parameter. And that's because there's a very subtle stability problem here having to do with a phenomenon found in plasma physics called Landau damping, where a macroscopic variable like the order parameter can decay and act stable, even though at a more refined description, a certain quantity that's a density description of the oscillators is neutral. So I won't really have time to say much about that, but you could look up our work, my paper with Merola in 1991, where we did this stability problem. You might find it interesting. Anyway, we also then many years later figured out the linear stability of this branch, and it was also delicate in the same way with a continuous spectrum on the imaginary axis. And then recently there was a big breakthrough from work by Ed Ott and Tom Antonsen, where they were able to really understand the global stability and explain why does the Kuramoto model seem to have just this one attractor. They could explain that. It was a really slick, wonderful analysis. And the finite end problem is still open. People don't really know how to state the correct result. But I mean, approximately the statement is that for finite n, for most initial conditions, for most realizations of the frequencies, the system will, in the long run, behave in a way that's close to this curve. And you may have heard I used many qualifiers there, you know, for most this and for most that and for most of the time. So that's got to be the correct theorem, but we don't know how to make it precise or how to prove it. Okay, so but let me just try and finish by showing you what this analysis is, because you might think, how would you even analyze this system? And it's surprisingly easy if you're a genius like Kuramoto. So let me show you his argument. He guessed that there would be steady solutions, which we could see in the simulations looks plausible, that in the rotating frame, it looked like the order parameter stopped moving. So it would go to some constant value and its angle would not change. And the whole problem has a rotational symmetry. So we can set the angle of the order parameter to 0 without loss of generality. So if you do that, then the governing equations for the Kuramoto model, it turns out, can be written in terms of that order parameter. It's, I mean, remember, this is the order parameter, this thing in here. You just write the sine function as the imaginary part of this expression. And this expression is the order parameter, but minus this quantity theta I. So you end up getting that the Kuramoto model with no approximation can be written in terms of the order parameter this way. And that's remarkable because, you know, with this choice that we're in the frame where the angle of the order parameter is 0, it all boils down to this little equation, which looks like a one-dimensional problem. Instead of an infinite dimensional problem where this n was large, it looks like everything has uncoupled. And I've just got theta I, its time rate of change depends on theta I and these constants. However, you'll notice that the quantity R is undetermined at this point. We said it's constant, but we don't know what its value is. So this is a very clever argument. He's going to say, assume it's a constant. All the thetas then look like they have decoupled and they can all be analyzed separately. In fact, we can solve this little one-dimensional problem analytically if we want. But then we'll have the motion of the thetas, and that motion has to be consistent with the order parameter R that we assume to begin with. If you see what I mean. Assume an R, solve for the thetas. The thetas are now the dots running around. They imply some average position in the complex plane, which gives you R. And that R has to agree with the R you assumed initially. So you get a self-consistency problem. And it's all predicated, like I say, on this assumption that R is exactly constant in the infinite n limit, which, I mean, mathematically, that sounds outrageous. Why would this infinite dimensional system have such a simple behavior? But that's a typical thing in statistical physics. They just look for simple solutions and often they work. So it's kind of wild. So anyway, let's just analyze this. If we assume that R is constant, can we study this little equation? Yes, I mean, if you've taken a course in nonlinear dynamics, or even just you're good at math, you can see what to do with this. I mean, just look at it. This equation you can think of as just a point moving around a circle. And when this quantity is positive, theta will move around the circle. But if this quantity is 0, theta will get stuck. I mean, in other words, let's put it this way. If the magnitude of the random frequency omega I is less than this quantity kr, this equation will have a 0. And by an elementary graphical argument, you can prove that all theta's initial conditions will approach a fixed point, an equilibrium point. And that's what we were seeing in the simulations. Remember that the oscillators with their frequency in the middle of the distribution, the green and the yellow and the orange, they appeared frozen. Those are what I'm calling locked oscillators. And this analysis shows that they're all the ones whose frequencies lie within a distance kr of the mean. Whereas the drifting oscillators are the ones in the tails. Those were the red and blue and purple oscillators that we saw running around. So this analysis instantly predicts the splitting that we saw in the simulation. But as I keep emphasizing, Kuramoto did this in his head without the benefit of computers. He later, I mean, it was all later confirmed in computer simulation. But anyway, so he's predicting a state of partial synchronization. And now the question is to self-consistently calculate this quantity R. And so here's how he does it. He says, look for steady state solutions of this equation, assuming that R has converged to its R infinity. Find those steady state solutions. They depend on the assumed R infinity, but they must also be consistent with R infinity being the average of the e to the I thetas. And that raises a little bit of a paradox that might worry you at this point, which is how can R infinity be independent of time, given that the oscillators at the tails are drifting around? And Kuramoto's answer is, well, even though they're individually drifting, what if they form a stationary distribution on the circle? Then they will contribute a constant to the average, right? I mean, it's like the individual molecules of air in this room that I'm in, they're moving around, yet there's a well-defined average temperature in the room because the molecules are making a statistically steady distribution. So that's what he assumes, that those dots we saw drifting, the red and purple, if we had infinitely many of them, we would see them forming a stationary distribution on the circle. So that's another cool, ingenious assumption of his, and it seems to be right. So here's the calculation. The order parameter, we said, is the average of the e to the I thetas. That average gets a contribution from locked oscillators in the middle of the frequency distribution and from the drifting oscillators in the tails. Now, the locked oscillators are the ones that make theta dot equals 0, which would correspond to this equation. And so then he calculates this average e to the I theta. Those oscillators have frequencies between minus kr and kr. You have to weight them according to their statistical weight, g of omega. And they have an e to the I theta that depends on omega through this relationship. So changing variables from omega to theta by using this change of variables, he ends up getting this little integral. And this quantity kr is a constant. It comes outside the integral. And so just stare at that. And here's some messy integral that depends on whatever the distribution function, the g, the bell-shaped curve. If that's Gaussian, we have some nasty integral to do. Actually, if this g is a Cauchy distribution, sometimes called a Lorentz distribution, that we could do the integral exactly in closed form. And Kuramoto assumed that that g was of that form, so he could do that integral. That's the distribution, basically looks like 1 over 1 plus omega squared. Has heavy tails, but it's a nice bell-shaped distribution. So anyway, I mean, but he can do the analysis for any g that has a bell shape. Okay, then what about the drifting oscillators? And then I'm almost done. Amazingly, it turns out the drifting oscillators contribute nothing, 0. And here's how you can see it. He assumes that their density on the circle is inversely proportional to their velocity. That's correct if you think about fluid dynamics, like you think of it as a fluid of oscillators of each frequency running like in traffic flow, if you've ever taught traffic flow. Density being inversely proportional to velocity is like saying, if you imagine cars on the highway and their density will be high when there's a congestion, like maybe due to a traffic accident or road work being done. Right, where the velocity is low, the density is high. The cars will get all crowded there. If you conserve cars. I mean, in other words, in fluid dynamics, we have this continuity equation that, that amounts to conservation of molecules or conservation of mass. Here it would be conservation of oscillators of a given frequency omega. And that conservation law in steady state corresponds to density being inversely proportional to velocity, to speed, I guess I should say. So he makes that assumption because he's assuming a stationary distribution. And then with that density on the circle, he calculates the average e to the I theta. It's weighted according to that density, and with the frequencies weighted according to their numbers. It's only for these oscillators in the tails. And plugging in this density and using the evenness of G around its mean, with a little bit of work, you can show that it actually cancels out. It becomes 0. So that's kind of miraculous. And it's why the evenness distribution on G is very helpful to him. If it's not, G is not even, this isn't 0. But in that case is harder, and people have thought about it since then. But taking the simplest case with even G, his self-consistency equation boils down to R infinity is the average of the e to the I thetas. It's just getting a contribution from the locked oscillators because we showed the drifters give 0. And so he ends up getting this equation as the self-consistency equation. And you'll notice that it has R infinity on both sides. So 0 is a solution. If R infinity is, this is an equation for R infinity as a function of K. It looks messy, but it's a function for that bifurcating branch, right? R infinity is some complicated function of K. The thetas integrate out. It's just R infinity in terms of K. And so one solution is R infinity equals 0, which is that, we saw that there was a 0 branch in the bifurcation picture. That'd be perfectly incoherent. That's always a possible solution. The oscillator is not getting in sync at all. Or if you cancel out that solution, divide out R infinity on both sides, then you get 1 equals K times something that only depends on K through this term. And it's an implicit expression, but if you're interested in where that bifurcating branch sort of comes off the x-axis, you can look at the limit as K goes to, as R infinity goes to 0. That's where that branch meets the axis. If I go back in my pictures here, let's see. What I'm referring to is this picture. If I follow this branch all the way back down to here, it's like tracing R infinity down to 0. So if I go back to this equation and plug in R equals, cancel out the R infinity on both sides, here and here, 1 equals K, some integral of cosine squared, I would plug in G of 0. And that's just a constant. That's the maximum of that G curve. Anyway, you can do this integral, and this is what gives Kuramoto a formula for K critical that works, and also for the bifurcating branch where he has 1 equals K times this messy integral. He can do it for some choices of G, and that gives him that curve. So I just wanted to show you some of the math, because I know if you're hearing a math talk, you want to see some math. Of course, I skipped some steps, but I hope you could follow the idea. Anyway, that's an example of how we analyze systems that self-synchronize. And it's only the simplest model. There are many assumptions in it. The field has moved on to many other directions, which we could talk about, but I don't want to keep you too long. So I think I will stop there and take your questions or comments. Okay, thanks very much.
Okay. So thank you very much, Professor Stephen. So this was really, really insightful. I'll allow anyone